I used to believe my son was a good man, until I discovered he was injecting neurological drugs into his own daughter and locked me in a mental institution to silence me. I've stayed quiet for too long, but today I'm telling everything. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong. Hit subscribe to follow more chilling episodes from us. The sky over Willow Ridge was a cold lavender gray when Helen Monroe stepped off the long-distance bus, dragging a Navy suitcase behind her. It was the same suitcase she and Thomas had taken on their honeymoon 50 years ago, scuffed corners, a broken zipper tooth, and a leather handle that had been sewn back more than once. Everything she owned now fit inside it. The air smelled like pine and roasted coffee drifting from the small shop across Main Street. But she didn't stop. She didn't look back. Helen adjusted the collar of her tweed coat and took a breath sharp enough to sting. The autumn chill hadn't reached the bone just yet, but it would. It always did in Willow Ridge, especially in October. Waiting near the roundabout was a silver SUV polished like a realtor's promise. Inside sat her son Daniel, checking something on his phone, and beside him Vanessa, his wife of 20 years, tapping her French manicured nails against the steering wheel like a metronome. Helen raised her hand in a hesitant wave. Daniel looked up, smiled briefly, and got out to open the trunk. "Hey, Mom," he said, voice polite but stretched thin. "How was the ride?" "Quiet. A few too many potholes, but the mountains were beautiful." She tried to laugh to fill the awkward space between them with warmth. It didn't work. Vanessa didn't get out of the car. Helen slid into the back seat, her eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror. Vanessa's gaze met hers there just for a second, before flicking away. No greeting, not even a forced one. As the car pulled away from the station, Helen pressed her palm to the window and watched the town blur past the old bakery with the rusting sign, the library where she'd once read poetry aloud, and the school her son used to bike to every morning. So much had changed, but the roads still curved the same. She wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here because her house had grown too empty, because her doctor gently suggested she not live alone anymore, because Daniel had said, "Why don't you come stay with us, Mom? We've got space. The kids will love it." So she came. Helen had imagined it more than once: warm dinners, soft voices, the smell of vanilla candles and laughter. She imagined being useful cooking, telling stories, being present. She hadn't imagined silence in the front seat, or the way Vanessa's lips tightened every time Helen spoke. The Monroe house sat at the top of Juniper Hill, a sleek modern two-story, painted in tasteful grays and whites, with tall windows that looked like they never wanted to be touched. "Here we are," Daniel said, forcing cheer as he opened the garage. Helen stepped inside and blinked under the harsh LED lights. Clean countertops, beige carpets, a couch so white it looked allergic to real life, a far cry from the book-stacked, slightly cluttered home she once shared with Thomas. "Mom," a voice called, and just like that the frost cracked. Logan came barreling down the stairs, 15 wild curls, hoodie half-zipped, and wrapped his arms around her in a fierce hug. "Grandma, finally. I thought you were coming yesterday." "They canceled my train," she smiled, clutching him like a life vest. "You've grown taller." "I'm almost 6 feet," he beamed. "You're still my little cricket." He rolled his eyes but didn't pull away. Behind him at the top of the stairs stood Ava, 17 long hair headphones around her neck, eyes outlined in eyeliner and something heavier. She didn't run to hug Helen, but she did nod. That was something. Helen spent the next hour unpacking in the guest room, formerly the office, now redressed with a fresh duvet and an armchair that looked good but didn't invite sitting. She placed her few books on the nightstand, Steinbeck Rilke, and the old leather journal she never went a day without. Later that evening she cooked, not because she was asked to, but because it felt like the only way to carve a place for herself. The kitchen was for an induction stove, no spices within reach, but her hands remembered. Roasted chicken with rosemary, garlic potatoes, homemade cornbread. Daniel used to love her cornbread. When she brought the food to the table, Logan's face lit up. Vanessa, however, raised a brow. "That's a lot of butter, Helen." "Just a little indulgence. It's Sunday." Daniel cleared his throat. "Smells great, Mom. They ate in near silence except for Logan's mumbled appreciation. Ava picked at her food. Vanessa scrolled through her phone under the table. Helen turned to Ava, still writing poetry. Ava paused. Her fork hovered. She looked up startled. "I used to," she muttered. "You were good. I still have that one you sent me last year, the one about the window in the sea." Ava's lips twitched, barely a smile. "That one was kind of lame." "Not to me," Helen said softly. Vanessa pushed her chair back. "I have a Zoom call. The LA client." She left the table. Daniel tried to smile. "She's under a lot of pressure at work." I'm sure Helen nodded. She washed the dishes by hand after dinner. Vanessa had loaded the dishwasher already, but Helen preferred soap and water. The quiet splash grounded her. Behind her, Logan brought over 2 mugs. Hot chocolate, he grinned. Double marshmallows. "Don't tell Mom." They sat on the back porch under a sky shot through with stars. "You okay, Grandma?" Helen sipped her chocolate and paused. "I'm glad to be here." Logan nodded. "She didn't want you to come, you know." Helen's eyes didn't move. "Your mom," he shrugged. "She said we didn't have space. But Dad told her to stop being dramatic. Said you needed us." "Did he?" "Yeah." There was a long pause. "You know," Helen said, setting her cup down, "when your father was your age, he broke his wrist, climbing the neighbor's tree. I told him to be careful, but he swore he saw a bird's nest." Logan laughed. Classic Dad. The next day, Helen helped Ava with her English essay. It was about Sylvia Plath. Ava hated the assignment. She was so dramatic, Ava said. She put her head in the oven. "She was in pain," Helen replied. "She wrote because it was the only way she could scream without breaking the world." Ava stared at her. Then she rewrote her opening paragraph. Later that week, Helen offered to pick up groceries. Vanessa hesitated. "We usually use Instacart. I could use the fresh air." "Well, okay then. Here's the list." Vanessa handed over a color-coded spreadsheet. At the store, Helen bumped into an old friend, Martha, from the library council. Back in town, Martha asked, eyes kind but surprised. "Just staying with Daniel for a bit," Helen replied. "Nice. Good of them to take you in." Helen smiled, but something in the phrasing stung. "Take her in like a stray." Back at home, she prepared stew, not fancy, just warm. Vanessa didn't join them for dinner. "She's fasting," Daniel explained. "Some kind of cleanse." Helen watched her son across the table. The man who once wept when he lost his first tooth. Who built a tree house, crooked but proud. Who wrote her letters from college full of silly poems. Now his eyes rarely met hers. She saw the tiredness in his face, the lines that hadn't been there before. Something was off, not just fatigue distance. Still she persisted. Every day she found a way to be present. Ava, despite her walls, started asking Helen about books. Logan told her about his crush on a girl named Rhea. Helen laughed with him, gave advice. But the warmth wasn't universal. That Thursday, Helen overheard Vanessa in the hallway. "She's rearranging the spice rack now. Daniel, it's like she's trying to replace me in my own kitchen." "Come on, Vanessa." You didn't see the way she looks at Ava. Like I'm a failure. Like she's the only one who knows anything. She's trying to help. She's overstepping, always has. Helen stood frozen by the bathroom door, not making a sound. That night she didn't sleep much. Instead, she sat at her desk pen, scratching in her leather journal. She wrote, "There is something aching behind every quiet kindness. And sometimes the people who say nothing carry the heaviest truths." At breakfast, Vanessa didn't come down. Daniel said nothing. Logan looked uncomfortable. Ava left early for school. Helen buttered toast. She ate in silence. Outside, the wind shook the trees. Inside, Helen began to notice something else. A flicker in Ava's eyes when she passed her mother. A tension in Logan's shoulders when Daniel raised his voice. Something unspoken coiled just beneath the calm. That night, as she turned off her lamp, she caught her reflection in the mirror. An old woman, yes, but not foolish, not blind. Behind her in the hallway, Vanessa stood watching, her arms crossed. She said nothing, but the way she looked at Helen was not just cold. It was unfamiliar, like she was staring at a stranger in her own home. By the end of the second week, Helen Monroe knew something was shifting. Something invisible but undeniable. Not like a thunderstorm, but more like fog creeping under the door. It didn't shout, it settled. Slowly, thoroughly. It started with silence. At first, Helen thought Vanessa was simply busy. Work from home, back-to-back meetings, the stress of juggling corporate deliverables and family obligations. That much was believable. But then came the cold shoulders in the kitchen, the way Vanessa would move things Helen had just arranged, the low-volume conversations with Daniel that cut off the moment she entered the room. A brief pause followed by that tired, practiced smile. Helen had seen this before in classrooms, in book clubs, in her own family. People don't have to speak to make it clear they no longer want you in their orbit. One morning, Helen came down early to prepare breakfast. She was slicing strawberries for Logan's cereal when Vanessa walked in, towel still wrapped around her head. "You didn't have to do that," Vanessa said flatly, nodding at the fruit. Helen looked up. "It's no trouble, I enjoy it." Vanessa pulled out a bottle of green juice and didn't respond. They stood in silence for a while, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. When Vanessa finally left the room, Helen exhaled through her nose. It was a small thing, but sometimes small things build into avalanches. Daniel, for his part, had become absent, not in body but in spirit. He was there every morning sipping his black coffee, answering emails on his tablet. He asked how she slept. He smiled in a practiced way, but his words floated on the surface, never sinking into anything real. He came home late more often now, murmuring something about clients, traffic-delayed meetings. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek, nodded to the kids, and disappeared into his office. At dinner, he chewed methodically and barely joined the conversation, except to ask Logan about school or remind Ava to take the SAT practice test. To Helen, it felt like watching her son wear a costume stitched from expectations. Husband, father, provider. But none of it looked comfortable on him anymore. She wanted to ask what was wrong. She wanted to ask where he went when he looked like he was home, but wasn't. But every time she tried, he found an excuse to stand up and walk away. Ava had gone silent too, not in defiance like many teenagers. This was something more haunted. She rarely came out of her room except for meals. Her hair, once a cascade of color and curls, was now flattened, pulled into a low ponytail, as if she couldn't be bothered. Her headphones were always on giant black domes that swallowed her whole world. And her eyes. Helen caught them once across the hallway. Eyes rimmed in something that wasn't makeup. Ava blinked quickly, turned away. But Helen knew. She'd seen that look in her own mirror once after Thomas died. The look of someone who cried so often, so quietly, that the body simply gave up trying to hide it anymore. Helen knocked on her door that night. Just a gentle tap. "Ava, sweetheart, I made your favorite, chicken marsala." A pause. Then a voice hoarse and dry, "I'm not hungry." She didn't push. She placed the plate by the door and walked away. The plate remained untouched until morning. Logan was the last one to drift. At first he clung to Helen like she was a lifeline. Hot chocolate on the porch, little jokes over dinner, inside quips that made Ava roll her eyes. But then slowly something crept in. He stopped coming to the kitchen to sneak sugar. He answered in shorter sentences, and he always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. It wasn't until Helen overheard a hushed exchange, Logan begging Vanessa not to cancel his weekend plans just because Grandma was home, that she understood. Vanessa was laying down new lines, drawing invisible fences, dividing loyalties. By the third week, the house had transformed. Not visibly, everything still looked immaculate, magazine perfect, but the energy inside had shifted. It was colder, calmer in the way forests are calm right before a storm. Helen started spending more time in her room. She wrote in her journal, reread old poems, watched the wind bend the trees outside her window. She didn't ask to help with dinner anymore, didn't volunteer to do laundry. She knew better than to try to insert herself where she wasn't wanted. But she still watched. She watched Daniel come home later each night. She watched Vanessa close her laptop with more force than necessary. She watched Ava's hands shake slightly when she poured tea. And one night just after midnight, Helen woke to a sound that didn't belong. A voice, soft, cracked, uneven. She sat up in bed, heart thudding. The voice came again, muffled but close. She opened her door quietly, walked barefoot down the hall, and stopped outside Ava's room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, moonlight spilled across the floor like spilled milk. Ava was curled up in bed, her arms wrapped around her legs, her head tossed lightly, face glistening with sweat. The headphones had slipped off. And then she said it, barely more than a whisper. "No, please. I don't want to. Don't make me do it again. Don't inject me. Please, no more. Helen froze. Her stomach dropped like an elevator cable just snapped. She stepped back slowly, almost afraid to breathe. Ava whimpered, rolled over, murmuring again, Don't tell, Grandma. They'll find out. Helen backed away and returned to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling. The dream could have meant anything. Teenagers say strange things in their sleep. But this wasn't strange. This was specific. Inject. Don't tell Grandma. Helen didn't sleep the rest of the night. At breakfast, Ava didn't come down. Vanessa claimed she was tired. Helen didn't ask questions. She watched Logan stir his cereal listlessly. She watched Daniel stare at his phone. The fog in her chest thickened. Later that day, Helen knocked on Ava's door. No answer. She opened it slowly. The room smelled faintly of lavender lotion and something metallic. On the desk, Ava's sketchbook lay half open. Helen didn't mean to look, but her eyes landed on a drawing. A girl, slumped in a chair, wires coming out of her arms, surrounded by dark, shapeless figures in lab coats. Helen's breath caught. She stepped back, closed the door, heart pounding. Back in her own room, she opened her journal. She didn't write poetry this time. She wrote facts. A list. Ava's change in behavior. The sleep-talking. The drawing. Vanessa's increasing agitation. Daniel's withdrawal. Something was happening in this house. Something her presence had stirred. Something no one wanted her to see. But she was seeing it now. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The morning sun in Willow Ridge filtered in like diluted gold through the curtains of Helen Monroe's guest room, casting soft lines on the floor like prison bars made of light. She sat at the edge of the bed, sipping weak coffee, staring at the wallpaper pattern, little leaves climbing imaginary vines. But her mind was elsewhere. Ava's voice still echoed from the night before. Murmured pleas in sleep. Whispers about injections and secrecy. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the mug down. Helen had spent a lifetime writing novels filled with human pain, the quiet kind, the kind that hid under dinner conversations and polite smiles. That's where the real trauma lived, not in screams, in silence. And silence filled this house like insulation. Later that afternoon, Helen stood at the threshold of Ava's room again. The door was open this time. The air smelled faintly of peppermint lotion and old paper. A hoodie hung limply on the back of her chair sleeve, stretched as if they'd been pulled during anxious moments. The walls were bare except for one faded Polaroid of Ava and Logan at the beach taped above the dresser mirror. She wasn't snooping. At least that's what she told herself. Helen stepped inside softly, feet almost floating across the carpet. She wasn't looking for anything. But then she noticed the pillow. It was oddly plump, misaligned, as if something had been hastily shoved beneath it. Something square. Not soft like a plush toy. Flat. Edged. She hesitated. Her hand moved slowly. When she lifted the pillow, she found it a journal. Not the leather kind like her own, but a spiral-bound notebook, its corners dog-eared and its spine nearly unraveled. The front cover had no name, only a single sticker in the top corner, a wilted daisy. Helen's heart pounded a rhythm louder than the wind tapping against the window. This wasn't a journal meant for someone else's eyes, and yet she opened it. The first pages were ordinary. Lyrics, doodles, quotes from obscure books and lines from Ava's favorite indie songs. But as she turned further, the handwriting changed, slanted, erratic, heavier. The entries became fragmented, chaotic, a pattern that was familiar to Helen not in words, but in emotional cadence. This was a voice under siege. She doesn't believe me. She looks at me and sees her perfect mirror, not the cracks beneath. He said it's normal, that it's all part of the process. The pressure's building. I can't sleep. I don't even dream anymore. Just voices. Humming. The needle. Helen's hands tightened around the edges of the paper. Further down, another scrawled line. There's a stranger in the house, and it's not Grandma. Another. Dad knows. Of course he does. They talk behind closed doors. I heard them. And finally, in nearly illegible ink, pressed so hard into the paper the pen tore through. Don't make me do it again. Helen closed the journal slowly, as if afraid it might scream. She sat on Ava's bed, trying to steady her breath. Outside, a car passed. A dog barked in the distance. The world went on, unaware that her world had just been cracked open. She looked around Ava's room again. The blankets were half kicked off. One sock lay crumpled near the footboard. A pair of prescription bottles, both unmarked, sat in a drawer by the desk, barely hidden beneath a stack of school papers. Helen had seen enough. This wasn't teenage melodrama. This was something darker, systemic, coordinated. She took the journal back to her room and hid it under the lining of her suitcase in a zippered pouch no one ever checked. When Vanessa came knocking later that evening, too brightly, too forced, Helen kept her face neutral. "Dinner in 20, Vanessa said. "We're ordering in." "Lovely," Helen replied, voice calm. "I'll be down shortly." As soon as the door shut, she reached for her pen. In her own journal, she didn't write poetry tonight. She wrote in bullet points, concise, exacting, the way a witness might, a novelist turned detective. Ava's notebook hidden under her pillow. Mentions of pressure needles being forced. Confirms prior night's sleep talk. Mentions father's knowledge. Use of term stranger in the house. 2 unidentified pill bottles in drawer. Helen paused before adding the last line. "This is not just dysfunction, this is danger." At dinner, Ava didn't say a word. She picked at her low mane eyes, low nails bitten down to uneven stubs. Logan made a joke about their soggy spring rolls. No one laughed. Daniel scrolled through work emails, even as he chewed. Vanessa watched Helen the way a cat watches a bird it's pretending not to care about. "So Mom," Daniel said between bites, "how are you settling in? Still getting used to the house?" Helen set her fork down. "The house is very modern," she replied carefully. "But people make the home." Vanessa's jaw tightened. Helen turned to Ava. "Sweetheart, I found an old book of Sylvia Plath poems in the attic. If you're still writing, I thought you might enjoy." "I'm not," Ava said, sharp and flat. Silence dropped like a stone. Daniel cleared his throat. "School's been heavy lately." Helen nodded, but her gaze stayed on Ava. For a split second, their eyes locked. There it was, a flicker, something like fear or plea, a silent Morse code embedded in a glance. "You see me, don't you?" But Ava looked away before Helen could respond. That night, Helen stood in the hallway again. Ava's door was closed. There was no sound. She returned to her room and pulled out the journal again. She flipped to the back, searching for anything more. Something clearer, something that said, "Here is the truth. Now do something." Instead, she found torn pages, jagged rips, a whole chunk of entries missing, as if someone had ripped them out hastily, angrily. Helen's skin prickled. She remembered what Ava had whispered in her dream. "Don't inject me again." Remembered the drawing, the silence, the missing time. She didn't know what the injections were. Therapy, experimental treatments. Something far worse. But she knew the language of secrets, and this house was filled with them. Just before bed, she crept down to the living room. The family calendar hung on the side of the fridge, a meticulously color-coded spreadsheet of appointments and errands. Helen studied the notes. Ava's name appeared on Thursdays. A recurring note, wellness eval, 3 p.m., Dr. Ng. She'd seen that name before. Helen walked back to her room and searched online. Dr. Jules Ng, licensed psychiatrist researcher at the Ridgepoint Neurolab, specializes in adolescent cognitive trials, partnered with several pharmaceutical companies. And then a headline, Ridgepoint Lab launches clinical study on neural inhibition drug for teens with emotional regulation disorders. Helen stared at the article. She felt bile rise in her throat. No, not possible. She read on. The drug was in phase 2 trials. Parent and minor consent required. Supervised administration. Focus group data sealed for privacy. It was all legal, if the boxes were checked, if no one forged the papers, if no one lied. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk watching the moon crawl across the window pane like a slow witness. Sometime past 3 a.m. she heard footsteps in the hallway. Ava, sneaking past. Helen opened her door just a crack. Ava padded to the bathroom, barefoot, hoodie drawn tight. She stood at the sink for a long time, then opened the medicine cabinet. She took something small, swallowed dry, then leaned forward. Helen watched her reflection in the mirror. The girl looked ghosted, half there. When Ava turned back, she paused, stared down the hallway. Their eyes met again. Ava didn't flinch this time. She just stood there, and then in the smallest voice, almost inaudible, "Please don't say anything." Then she turned and slipped back into her room. Helen closed her door slowly, her throat tight, her heart breaking. Whatever was happening in this house, Ava was caught in it, and she was asking not with words, not with notes, but with every inch of her silence for someone to notice. Helen sat down at her desk, flipped open her own journal. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she wrote a sentence not for a character in a novel, but for herself. The story is real now. I am not writing it. I am inside it. And if I don't act soon, this chapter may end with a scream no one will hear. She underlined it twice. Helen Monroe had once believed that the deepest betrayals always came loudly shouted across tables, slammed in doors, screamed through tears. But what she was living now, this was different. This betrayal, if that was what it was, unfolded in the quiet, in subtle patterns, in soft clicks of a locked door, in vanishing appointment cards, in too smooth smiles and half-spoken phrases. She had become an observer in her own son's home, a guest who no longer asked questions, only watched and recorded. She had begun keeping a second journal, not for poetry or reflections, but for facts, for patterns, for data, and every day now she saw more. Monday, 10:34 p.m. Vanessa and Ava leave the house. Vanessa's arm around Ava's shoulder. Ava expressionless. No school bag. Return 6:11 p.m. Ava walks ahead. Vanessa is on the phone. Ava goes straight upstairs. Doesn't come down for dinner. Helen made no mention of it at the table. Vanessa didn't offer explanation. Daniel didn't ask. Tuesday, 11:47 p.m. Helen hears Daniel in his office. Phone call. She sneaks into the hallway. Hears only fragments. No, she hasn't said anything yet. We're monitoring her. Adjust the dosage. I told you she signed it even if she doesn't remember. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. Helen stood in the dark hall, her palm flat against the wallpaper. She couldn't feel her legs. Her body had gone numb. She returned to her room and wrote down every word she could remember. She reread Ava's torn journal pages, now folded and hidden beneath the drawer lining of her nightstand. There was something happening here, and it wasn't just bad parenting or cold indifference. It was procedural, it was practiced, and it was protected. Daniel and Vanessa had become experts in making darkness look like order. That week, Helen started timing the outings. Thursdays were always consistent. At exactly 2:45 p.m., Vanessa and Ava would leave the house. Always in the Lexus, always through the back driveway. They returned between 5:45 and 6:30, every time, and every time Ava looked worse. Not physically, not in any way most people would notice. But Helen had lived long enough to know the quiet signs, slightly slower steps, unfocused eyes, the kind of fatigue that sits in the bone, the kind of fatigue that medication leaves behind. Helen knew what to look for. She began searching for more. One morning, while Vanessa was out and Daniel was working in the basement, Helen went looking. It wasn't sneaky, it wasn't wrong, it was survival. She started in the study, Daniel's office. She knew from his habits that he rarely locked drawers, only the safe. The desk was meticulously organized, a MacBook docked in the center pens, aligned in a leather holder folders labeled with acronyms only corporate lifers would understand. She checked the drawers anyway. First drawer, contracts, invoices, receipts. Second drawer, generic office supplies. Third drawer, locked. Helen exhaled. She examined the cabinet under the bookshelves. There, behind several stacked boxes of paper, was the safe, medium-sized gray fingerprint scanner and a manual code panel. Helen's stomach twisted. She had seen Daniel open it before long ago when Thomas had died, and Daniel had stored some of the life insurance papers inside. His passcode hadn't changed then. She doubted it had now. She remembered it clearly. A date burned into her heart. 0701 July 1st. The day his daughter was born. The day Ava came into the world. She stared at the keypad, pulse racing. She typed it in. A soft beep. Click. The safe door slid open. She almost collapsed from the weight of relief and dread. Inside were 3 folders, thick, each labeled. The first Ridgepoint consent forms, the second correspondence adjustments, the third trial schedule, RP Youth Home subjects. She pulled the first one out and opened it. What she saw made her blood go cold. Signed documents. Parental consent waivers. Medical authorization for Ava Monroe to participate in a cognitive stabilization study involving moderate dosage regulation of an experimental neural inhibition compound. Her signature was forged. Helen recognized Ava's handwriting from school papers and journals. The signature on the form was neat, perfect, but not hers. It lacked the slight upward hook on the A and the tilt Ava had always used. Worse still, the signature on the parental line was Daniel's, not Vanessa's. That in a sick way almost made sense. Vanessa had always been more careful about appearances. But Daniel, he had authorized this. Knowingly, willingly. And Ava had no idea. Helen flipped through the rest of the pages. Lab results, observation notes, dosage reports, side effect checklists. Then one sentence highlighted in red: subject shows elevated resistance and verbal distress during administration. Parental authority advised silence. Helen felt her breath catch in her throat. She placed the file back inside the safe, closed the door gently, and stepped back into the light of the hallway trembling. This wasn't just poor parenting. It wasn't even just manipulation. It was medical abuse. Vanessa and Daniel were subjecting their daughter to unauthorized experimentation. Or worse, authorized it through deception. Helen barely slept that night. Every creak in the floorboards felt louder, every shadow longer. She started keeping the journal on her at all times. She no longer trusted anyone in the house, and she had the growing sense, call it writer's instinct, call it paranoia, that someone had started watching her too. Sometimes she'd turn around and feel it. In the hallway mirror, she thought she saw a reflection behind her, footsteps outside her door at odd hours. A click that might have been a phone camera shutter. One morning she woke to find her suitcase slightly unzipped. Not wide open, just different. She had zipped it shut before sleeping, she was certain, and now it was open. She began hiding her notes in new places, double folding pages, tucking things inside hollowed-out books. She even switched her room's door lock, an old brass bolt she'd found in the garage. Quiet enough not to raise suspicion, but strong enough to hold. Then came the day when Ava broke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was in the kitchen. Vanessa had gone to yoga. Daniel was still on a call. Ava wandered in barefoot hoodie, oversized hair unbrushed. Helen was making tea. The girl didn't speak. She just sat at the kitchen island, elbows on the marble, and stared at the fridge like it held answers to questions no one asked. Helen placed a cup of chamomile tea in front of her. Ava stared at it. Then softly, as if speaking might collapse her, "I'm scared." Helen froze. She didn't say anything. Ava looked up. Her eyes were red swollen from nights without real rest. "I'm so scared, Grandma," she whispered. "I don't know what they're doing to me." Helen moved around the island slowly and knelt in front of her granddaughter. She took her hand. The girl flinched, then let her. "They said it was therapy," Ava said. "Just brain balancing, mood regulation. But I feel like I'm disappearing." Tears welled, then fell. "I forget things. Hours. Whole hours. And when I ask, Mom says I'm being dramatic, that I signed up for this. But I didn't. I never did." Helen squeezed her hand. Ava's voice trembled. "Dad watches me like I'm not his daughter, like I'm a project." Helen said nothing, because in that moment words were no longer enough. But she made a promise silently to the girl whose voice had finally cracked the surface. She would not let this go unseen. She would not let this go unanswered. And she would not let Ava disappear, not into silence, not into chemical fog, and not into the clean lines of a forged form. Helen was going to find the truth, and then burn every lie to ash. It was raining the morning Logan Monroe found his voice, the kind of rain that whispered rather than pounded, misty, curtain-like, brushing against the windows, as if it were too polite to intrude, yet too persistent to be ignored. The whole Monroe house was unusually quiet, and perhaps that was why Helen heard it so clearly. The first sign of a crack in the wall. Vanessa's voice sharp low. Logan's voice louder than usual, with that distinct strain of frustration only heard when a teenager's patience finally snaps. "I don't get it, Mom. Mai's exhausted all the time, and you just keep dragging her off to those evaluations or whatever. She's barely awake at dinner. What is this punishment disguised as therapy?" Helen froze on the stairs. From behind the half-closed kitchen door, she could see Logan, arms crossed, eyebrows pinched, in that way so eerily reminiscent of Daniel when he was younger. He was standing his ground even if his voice cracked under pressure. Vanessa stood across the island, hands braced on the marble counter, her face an unreadable canvas of restraint and simmering annoyance. "It's not your concern, Logan," she said coolly. "Ava's going through a process, one you don't understand. This is to help her." "Then why won't she talk to me anymore?" Logan cut in. Why does she flinch when Dad enters the room? Why did she throw up after last Thursday's appointment and lock herself in the bathroom for 2 hours? Vanessa blinked once, then her voice dipped lower. You're overstepping. This is between your father, me, and Ava. You're a child. Stop listening to things you don't understand. I'm 15, Logan said, voice shaking now but not retreating. And I'm not blind. Helen stepped into the kitchen then, before Vanessa's voice could rise again. Logan, she said gently, can you help me with the umbrella stand? It's sliding off its base again. He looked at her, eyes rimmed with something that might have been the beginning of tears or anger. He nodded once and followed her into the hallway. Neither spoke until they reached her room. Helen closed the door, locked it quietly, then turned to face him. You heard it too, she said. Logan dropped onto the edge of her reading chair, his shoulders folding inward. I thought I was just imagining it, he muttered. I mean, you grow up thinking your parents are right about everything. You trust them because you're supposed to, even when things feel off. Helen sat across from him on the window ledge, hands folded in her lap. When did it start? She asked. He rubbed his eyes, then shrugged. Maybe 6 months ago I'd catch bits of conversations. Mom saying things like dose tracking and Dad talking about viability windows. But every time I asked what they were talking about, they'd laugh it off. Said it was insurance paperwork, medical admin stuff. You know, boring adult things. He looked up at her. But then Ava changed. She started missing school, got more tired, more gray, you know. Not just sad, like she was fading. Helen nodded. Her throat was tight. I know exactly what you mean. I thought maybe she was just depressed. You know, teenage stuff. But then I found this little sticky note under her pillow. He pulled something out of his hoodie pocket, crumpled, nearly translucent from handling. It read in Ava's unmistakable handwriting, They're watching, don't tell anyone, don't trust Mom or Dad. Helen's hands shook as she took it. You haven't told anyone else about this? Logan shook his head. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. But I'm more scared for her. Helen leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Then we're going to do something about it. He looked up, eyes wide, hopeful, afraid. What do you mean? I mean, Helen said, voice firmer now, the way she used to sound in faculty meetings and book panels. We stopped being bystanders. They began that afternoon. First, they made a list, not of grievances, but of data. Helen retrieved her journal. Together, they filled out timelines, dates Ava had left with Vanessa, when she returned, how she behaved. Logan filled in gaps. Helen hadn't seen conversations, he'd overheard medications. He'd noticed moments Ava had tried to say something, but stopped short. Then came the plan. We need proof, Helen said. More than paper, more than words. Logan's eyes lit up. I've got a spare mic. And a cam, from Robotics Club, small enough to hide inside a power bank. Helen blinked. You have surveillance equipment. He gave her a half smile. I've got a YouTube channel. You'd be surprised what I've learned about tech. Together, they configured the tiny camera disguised as a portable charger. The audio range was surprisingly sharp, clear up to 20 feet in a quiet room. They decided on 2 placement zones, Daniel's office and the kitchen, both common meeting grounds. We have to be careful, Logan warned. Dad's not stupid. He checks things. Helen smiled grimly. Neither are we. That night, while Daniel took a post-dinner conference call and Vanessa was on her second glass of Chardonnay, Logan pretended to be searching for a charger near the hallway closet. He slipped the cam into the pencil holder on the edge of the office bookshelf. Later, Helen placed the second mic beneath the center island, taped discreetly behind the hidden lip under the marble. It was done. And suddenly everything felt heavier. They were no longer guessing. They were watching. The next morning, Logan ran point. Extracted the micro SD card while pretending to do homework, uploaded the files to a dummy drive. That evening in Helen's room, they listened. It was worse than she expected. Vanessa's voice clinical cold. If we increase her tolerance slowly, it won't trigger the side effects as visibly. Daniel tired but firm. The schedule matters. Eng's team is expecting a full cycle by next month. If Ava drops off, we lose the control group. Vanessa then sedate her heavier. She signed the form. We have that. Daniel, she doesn't remember signing it. Vanessa, so what? It's legal. Helen's nails dug into her palm. Logan stared at the screen. He looked older suddenly. Not 15. Not a child. They're hurting her, he said softly. Helen didn't speak. She couldn't. Instead, she copied the files. Stored backups. hid them in 3 different places, one in her room, one inside a hollow book on the living room shelf, and one she gave to Logan to keep at school. They weren't just gathering evidence anymore. They were preparing for war. As the evening wore on, Helen watched Logan study his parents differently, like he was seeing behind their skin, not with hatred but with dawning horror. At dinner, Ava didn't speak. Daniel served her vegetables like she was 7 again. Vanessa asked about her emotional calibration log. Logan barely touched his food. When the dishes were cleared, he turned to Helen. "I'm staying up late to finish some homework," he said loud enough for his parents to hear. She nodded. Later, in the quiet of her room, Logan whispered, "I think it's time we figure out what else is in that safe." Helen looked at him. "I already did," she whispered back, and told him everything. The forged forms, the dosage logs, the records of silence. Together they wrote a letter, not an email, not a text. A printed, carefully worded letter addressed to the state medical board. Helen would mail it in 2 days, but first they needed just one more recording, one that showed Ava in distress, one that proved the damage wasn't hypothetical. They agreed to wait until Thursday, the day of her next appointment. As Logan left the room that night, he turned back. "You're not just a grandma, you know." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you're kind of a spy." She smiled. "You're not too bad yourself." And for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel quite so alone, because 2 people had finally said what no one else would. Enough. The recording started with static. Then a voice, Daniel Monroe's, clear, measured, and disturbingly calm. Helen and Logan sat side by side at her desk, the room dimly lit by the soft amber glow of her reading lamp. Rain tapped gently against the window, but inside the walls of her room the tension was suffocating. "We're prepared to release the final dosage group on the 20th, Daniel said on the recording. "The younger subject, she's responded moderately well. There's some neurological resistance, but the inhibitors are stabilizing. We'll push forward as scheduled." There was a pause. Another voice, unknown male, muffled slightly, spoke with a slight European accent. "And the delivery? You said subject number 6 would be administered by next week. We're operating under deadline. She'll be ready," Daniel confirmed. "Her mother's managing the compliance. We've got a tight window before adolescence affects the baseline. She's still viable." Then came Vanessa's voice, sharp, impatient, cutting through the room like a cold blade. "We need to wrap this phase, Daniel. The longer we wait, the harder it gets. These kids, Logan's growing suspicious. And Ava, she's slipping. If we don't get this last round done, the data won't hold." Another pause. "They age fast," Vanessa added almost as an afterthought. "You blink and they're suddenly too smart to manipulate, too loud. We need to finish before they start asking the right questions." Helen froze. Her hand, resting on the desk, curled into a fist so tight her knuckles turned white. Logan was motionless, eyes wide, lips slightly parted as if he'd been punched without warning. They listened to the rest of the recording, though nothing afterward could match the impact of what had already been said. Her son Daniel, the same boy who once built pillow forts and read Calvin and Hobbes by flashlight, was now a trafficker of consent-trading compliance for clinical currency. Her daughter-in-law, Vanessa, played the role of the handler. Together they had turned their own daughter into a walking experiment and called it progress. The silence that followed the recording was unnatural. Logan broke it first. He didn't speak. He just stood up, walked to the far end of the room, and punched the wall with his bare fist. The thud wasn't loud, but it was final. Helen stood up slowly. She didn't move toward him. She didn't speak comfort. She let him breathe. Let him burn. When he finally turned around, eyes glassy but dry, she nodded. "They're not just hurting her," Logan said. "They're selling her." Helen picked up the drive. "We back this up twice, and tomorrow we start burning bridges." Logan didn't ask what that meant. They both already knew. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She tried reading. She tried music. She tried her old breathing exercises from when Thomas passed, but nothing slowed the noise in her chest. So close to midnight, she lit a candle, sat at her writing desk, and pulled out Ava's torn journal pages. She read them again, slower this time. "Mom holds my hand like she's squeezing a doll. Dad doesn't look me in the eye anymore. They talk around me like I'm already gone. The room with the white chair smells like lemons and fear. I throw up before we go. They say I'm helping science, but I didn't agree. I never agreed." Helen pressed the pages to her chest. Her eyes, dry all day, finally broke open. Tears slid down her cheeks, quiet and endless. The pain wasn't just maternal, it wasn't even grief. It was horror, a kind that shattered the order of the world. Because she had raised this man. She had kissed his forehead after nightmares. She had taught him to read, to question, to empathize. And now he was using his own child to fuel a pharmaceutical lie. For power, for money, for control. She didn't know where Daniel had gone wrong. Maybe it wasn't one big decision. Maybe it was 100 small ones stacked on top of each other like matchsticks until the flame was inevitable. But one thing was certain. She couldn't protect him anymore, and she couldn't forgive him. Around 2 a.m., she pulled her suitcase out from beneath the bed. Not to pack, to reach the hidden envelope in the lining. The forged consent form, Ava's fake signature, Daniel's real one. She sat on the bed and stared at it, running her fingers over the surface as if touch alone could summon justice. But justice would need more than paper. It would need confrontation and courage. At breakfast, no one spoke. Vanessa was back to her protein smoothie. Daniel read the paper. Business section only. Ava skipped breakfast entirely. Logan pretended to scroll his phone. Helen stirred her tea but didn't drink it. She didn't need caffeine. She needed resolve. Daniel stood first. I've got a noon consult. I'll be out most of the afternoon. Vanessa was next. I'm meeting with Jules at the Ridgepoint campus. We'll be gone a few hours. Helen's stomach churned at the casual mention of the doctor. Their accomplice. The one who carried out the injections like clockwork masked in scientific legitimacy. I'll stay in, she said. Suit yourself, Vanessa replied, already halfway to the door. When the house emptied, Helen and Logan set to work. They copied the recordings again. They uploaded encrypted versions to cloud storage. They created an anonymous tip file and scheduled it to send to the medical board, a local journalist and a family friend in the state attorney's office if they didn't cancel the send within 48 hours. Insurance. I don't want to go to school tomorrow, Logan said. Helen looked up. You have a test. He shook his head. No, I just want to be here, in case something happens. She didn't argue. She understood. Later that evening, Ava slipped into Helen's room. She didn't knock. She just stood in the doorway, wrapped in an oversized sweater, sleeves dangling past her fingers. Can I sit with you, she asked. Helen opened her arms without hesitation. The girl folded into her like origami, awkward angles and barely held together edges. They sat on the bed in silence. Finally, Ava whispered, Did I do something wrong? Helen blinked. No, sweetheart, you did everything right. Then why does it feel like I'm being punished? Helen held her tighter. Because sometimes the innocent are the ones who pay the highest cost when those in power lose their way. Ava didn't cry. She was past tears. But her body shook in Helen's arms, silent sobs that didn't reach her eyes. When she finally fell asleep, curled against her grandmother's shoulder, Helen whispered into her hair, I'm going to fix this. Then she laid Ava down gently and returned to her desk. She pulled out the journal again. This time she didn't write poetry. She wrote a vow. This house is a crime scene, and I am no longer a visitor. I am the witness. I am the voice. I am the fire. Helen Monroe had always known there would be consequences. She just hadn't expected them to come so soon or so viciously. It began with a phone call she never got to make. Friday morning after Logan left for school, and Ava remained in her room under the guise of a headache. Helen stood in the kitchen with the burner phone she and Logan had prepared for the tip-off. The envelope was sealed. The recordings backed up and time-stamped. The statement printed and notarized, ready to be delivered to the local police station. She had rehearsed what she would say, calm, factual, clear. She wasn't a frightened old woman. She was a witness, a grandmother, a whistleblower. She never even made it to the door. Daniel's voice stopped her. Going somewhere. Helen turned. He was standing by the fridge, dressed not for work, but something far more ominous. Black fleece pullover, athletic pants, no wedding ring. He looked like a man preparing to get something done. Helen forced a smile, just stepping out for a walk. In the rain, he asked casually. She glanced toward the window. It wasn't raining. She hadn't even realized her hand was shaking until he walked over and gently took the envelope from her fingers. I'll take that, he said. Daniel, but he was already flipping it open. As he pulled out the documents, his expression didn't change. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just read, silently, coldly. And then without a word, he walked over to the sink and dropped everything in. He turned on the garbage disposal. Paper shrieked, plastic cracked, water and ink blurred into pulp and fragments. Helen lunged forward. What are you doing? Protecting my family, he said simply. and then with a swiftness she didn't expect he shoved her, just hard enough. She stumbled backwards, hit the corner of the kitchen island, and slipped. Her hip slammed the floor with a sickening crunch, and her elbow struck tile. Pain bloomed up her side like a bruise made of lightning. She lay there, stunned, breath knocked clean out of her. Daniel stepped back, hands raised. "Oh no," he said loudly. "Mom, are you okay?" His voice carried not in concern but in performance. Vanessa ran in moments later, phone already in hand. "What happened?" she asked, feigning shock. "She fell," Daniel said, crouching beside Helen. "I think she hit her head. She's been disoriented lately, remember?" "I'm fine," Helen gasped, trying to sit up. Don't do this." But Vanessa was already dialing. "Hi, yes, my elderly mother-in-law just fell down the stairs. She's been confused lately. We're worried she may have hit her head again. She's been paranoid for weeks. Yes, please come quickly." The last thing Helen saw before her vision blurred was Vanessa pressing a cold hand to her forehead. "Shh," she whispered. "Just let this happen." The paramedics came within 10 minutes. Vanessa and Daniel gave calm, confident statements. "She's been seeing things," Vanessa said we were drugging her, that we were experimenting on our daughter. "Can you believe that? She's always had episodes," Daniel added, shaking his head sadly. "Paranoia, fixation. But lately it's gotten worse. She's obsessed with our daughter's doctor. She's accusing us of crimes. Honestly, we're scared she might hurt someone." Helen tried to speak, but her words came out slurred, half from the shock, half from the fast-acting sedative. She hadn't even realized Vanessa slipped into her tea earlier that morning. As the ambulance doors closed, she saw Logan sprinting up the driveway, his face pale, backpack bouncing against his shoulder. She tried to scream for him, but the sirens drowned everything out. She woke up hours later in a beige room, a single window with security bars. A name tag pinned to her chest read, "Helen Monroe, Temporary Observation." She tried to sit up, but the IV in her arm stung. A nurse entered, smiled too much. "You took quite a tumble, sweetie, but don't worry. You're in good hands." Helen blinked against the fluorescent light. "Where am I?" "Shady Hills Care Center," the nurse said cheerfully. "Your family said you've been struggling. Delusions, memory gaps. But that's okay. We're going to help you feel safe again." "No," Helen whispered. "You don't understand." "Oh, don't worry," the nurse said. "We've heard it all before." Helen turned her face to the wall. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. That night she was allowed a supervised call. She dialed Logan's number. It rang and rang, then straight to voicemail. She tried again, blocked. Her second call was intercepted by a nurse. "Family has requested no contact with minors," she explained. "They're my grandchildren," Helen snapped. "Not according to the directive," the nurse said, flipping through her clipboard. "Restraining boundaries due to psychotic risk." Helen felt like she was suffocating inside a padded cage. Vanessa and Daniel had moved fast. They'd not only neutralized her, they'd erased her. 2 days passed. Helen played the part. She answered questions calmly, agreed to rest, took the pills but held them under her tongue and spat them into a tissue when the nurse left. She kept her eyes open at night, memorizing shift schedules. On the 3rd day, a voice came through the window during her outdoor time. She was sitting on a bench beneath a sickly-looking tree in the rear courtyard when a whisper reached her. "Gran." She looked up. Logan stood on the other side of the fence, hoodie pulled, low breath fogging the air. Her heart nearly gave out. "I only have 2 minutes, he whispered. "They took your phone. Ava's grounded. I'm not allowed to talk about you." "Are you okay?" she whispered. He nodded. "I copied everything, the backups. I gave them to Mr. Carver. Your teacher, civics." Logan nodded. "He's a lawyer too, quietly active. He's reviewing everything. We'll get you out." Helen wanted to run to him, to grab his hands through the fence, but all she could do was nod. "Are you safe?" she asked. He hesitated. "Safer than her." Helen blinked. "Don't let them near Ava again," she said fiercely. No more silence." Logan nodded again. Then he was gone. That night, Helen stared at the ceiling and repeated her promise. "They will not win. You can drug me, lock me up, call me mad. But I am not finished. I am still her grandmother. And grandmothers don't vanish quietly." For 2 days, Helen Monroe didn't know if anyone was coming. The walls of Shady Hills were the color of oatmeal, meant to be soothing, but all they did was blur time. The overhead lights were too bright during the day, too dim at night. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon-scented lies. She played their game, smiled politely, answered questions with measured calm, nodded during check-ins. Read the tattered copy of Little Women they left in the rec room, even though she hated its sweetness in moments like these. But beneath the calm she watched, counted routines, listened to the rhythm of footsteps in the halls, waiting. Then on the third morning, during a routine check of her vitals, a nurse leaned in slightly too close. Her badge read Clara. "Your friend's coming," Clara whispered low enough to vanish into the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Act normal. We're almost there." Helen blinked slowly, then nodded. 10 minutes later, the intercom buzzed, and a voice called for her to report to the consultation room. The nurse led her through 2 security doors and down a corridor she hadn't seen before. This one had framed pictures, sunsets, waterfalls, attempts at normalcy. Inside the consultation room stood 2 men. One wore a sharp navy suit, thin-rimmed glasses, and a practiced half-smile. The other held a clipboard and wore a white coat stethoscope draped like theater costuming. Helen's knees nearly gave out when she recognized the man in the suit. "Charlie," she whispered. Charles Langston, once her brightest literature student. Now a defense attorney with a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic hell with surgical precision. He hadn't aged much, still had the same gentle eyes, only now they burned with quiet fury. "Hi, Professor Monroe," he said, stepping forward and taking her hands. "You didn't think I forgot what you did for me in '98, did you?" She tried to smile, but her lip trembled. "How did you—" "Logan. He got a letter to me through my old law firm. Didn't use phones. Smart kid. Wrote in code. But I understood enough to start digging." The doctor cleared his throat. "This consultation is not on the schedule, and I was not made aware of any outside review." "Oh, you were made aware," Charles cut in smoothly. "You just didn't read your email. Or the court order." He pulled out a document and placed it flat on the table. "Per judge's approval, we've filed an injunction against Monroe's forced psychiatric hold, based on new evidence including a forged mental health evaluation signed by a physician who's been deceased for 4 years. The doctor paled. I didn't know that." "You didn't check. That's negligence at best. Complicity at worst," Charles said evenly. He turned to Helen. "Your son and daughter-in-law created a fake psychiatric profile and used it to have you committed. There's no medical justification for your detainment here. They bribed a staffer to expedite processing. It's all in the report." Helen inhaled slowly. Not victory, but oxygen. Real air again. Charles motioned to Clara, who was already unlocking the straps on Helen's wrist protocol from a prior sedative dose they'd tried pushing 2 nights ago. "You're coming with me," Charles said. As they walked past the nurse's station, Helen looked straight ahead. No flinching, no tears, only clarity. The exit door buzzed, and for the first time in days she stepped into daylight. Outside the clouds were breaking. The air smelled like wet leaves and unfinished storms. Charles opened the passenger door for her. Once inside, he handed her a folder. "Here's everything we have so far. Recordings, medical forgeries, testimonies. I've already forwarded it to the state board." Helen flipped through the pages. There it was, Vanessa's name, Daniel's, Ava's, her family, in black ink. "How long do we have before they realize?" she asked. "They already know," Charles replied. "The facility called them when I walked in." Helen's eyes narrowed. "Then they'll move fast, which is why we're going faster." They drove in silence, not toward the Monroe house, to a safe apartment rented under Charles's firm. Helen slept for 12 hours straight. When she awoke, Logan was waiting. He dropped everything and wrapped his arms around her waist. "I thought they broke you," he said into her sweater. She held him so tightly she could barely breathe. "They almost did," she whispered. "But you held the line." They sat on the sofa, sunlight streaking the window. She looked at him. "Ava." He hesitated. "Vanessa took her out of school, says she's doing home recovery. But she hasn't let her leave her room, not even once." Helen clenched her fists. Charles returned that evening with a laptop. "Everything's been submitted. Legally, Ava can't be moved or medicated until a full inquiry is held. But we need physical proof that she's still inside and safe." "I'll go back," Helen said. "You sure?" "They're expecting a ghost. I'll give them a storm." The next morning, Helen returned to Willow Ridge. Not as a grandmother, as a witness. She walked up the front steps alone, her hair tied back, coat buttoned to her chin. The house looked the same, only colder. She rang the doorbell once. Vanessa opened it. Her face lost color instantly. You. Hello, Vanessa, Helen said. Miss me? Vanessa slammed the door. Helen didn't move. A moment later, Daniel opened it. You're trespassing, he said. No, Helen replied. I'm documenting. She held up her phone. Daniel paused. That's illegal. So is forging mental health evaluations. So is drugging your daughter. I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm ensuring that Ava isn't moved. Helen cut in. And that Logan has full legal right to remain with me until this is resolved. I've filed for temporary guardianship. Vanessa appeared behind Daniel, her face a brittle mask. You have no idea what you've done. Helen stepped closer. Oh, I do. She reached into her pocket, pulled out Ava's old journal pages, laminated now. Safe. I've listened to everything. Read every lie. You thought you could silence me. Lock me up. But here I am. She leaned in, her voice steel. This time no one stopping the truth. She turned and walked away. Behind her the house stood still, like a tomb. The air in the precinct was heavy with fluorescent buzz and whispered urgency. Helen Monroe sat across from Inspector Lyman in interview room B, the folder on the table between them glowing like a detonator in waiting. Inside it, Ava's torn journal pages, the forged medical forms, recordings of Daniel and Vanessa's conversations, and photographs Logan had secretly taken, dosage vials, appointment schedules, and a time-stamped video of Ava slumped unconscious in the back seat of Vanessa's Lexus. Helen's voice was steady as she spoke. This isn't some disciplinary issue. This is organized, premeditated experimentation on a minor without informed consent. Lyman, mid-50s, sharp jawline and patient eyes, leaned forward. You understand what you're accusing your son and his wife of? Helen nodded. I'm not accusing, she said. I'm reporting, and I'm bringing you evidence. She slid the flash drive across the table. Lyman took it. Inserted it into the precinct's secure laptop. A few keystrokes, and the first recording played Daniel's voice discussing subject viability and delivering Mai on time. Then Vanessa's words. If we don't finish before they start asking the right questions. He paused the recording. Behind the two-way mirror, a silent team of investigators was already reviewing every line of audio. A parallel unit had begun assembling the warrant paperwork. 30 minutes later, Lyman looked up. We'll act today. Helen exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. At precisely 3:12 p.m., 4 unmarked cars rolled to a stop outside the Monroe residence in Willow Ridge. The front lawn, manicured and unassuming, quickly became the center of an unfolding storm. Officers in plain clothes moved with quiet urgency. Neighbors peeked through blinds. A dog barked in the distance. Inside, Daniel sat in his office rereading a conference agenda for a symposium he no longer had any right to attend. Vanessa was in the kitchen pouring matcha into a glass tumbler. Neither of them heard the front door open. Mr. Monroe. We have a warrant to search the premises and secure any minors residing at this address. Daniel stood blinking. What is this? Step away from the desk, sir. One officer moved toward the back staircase. Ava's door was locked. Inside, she sat on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees, music playing softly from a speaker. She'd been denied visitors for days, food left on trays, her window nailed shut. When the door opened, she didn't react at first. Then a uniformed officer stepped in and crouched to her level. Hi, sweetheart. I'm Officer Reyes. You're safe now. Ava stared at him stunned, and then quietly she began to cry. Helen arrived 10 minutes later in Charles Langston's car. The house was already swarming evidence tags on furniture, laptops being bagged, drawers open. Ava was wrapped in a blanket sitting on the back of an ambulance step. Logan held her hand. Helen crossed the driveway in 3 strides. Ava, she breathed, kneeling. The girl turned. Eyes glassy, bruised emotionally but alive. I knew you'd come, she whispered. Helen hugged her so tightly she thought she might disappear into her skin. I promised, didn't I? Inside, Daniel stood against the far wall of his office, hands behind his head. Vanessa was beside him, pacing like a caged animal. Lyman entered. He didn't speak right away. He just placed a copy of the signed consent forms on the desk. Daniel looked down. It's not what it seems. Lyman raised an eyebrow. So you didn't authorize off-label neurological experimentation on your daughter. You didn't coordinate with an offshore firm to bypass FDA regulations. Daniel looked away. I did what I had to do, he muttered. She was unstable. It was for her own. Stop, Lyman said. That girl is a minor. She's not a clinical asset. And your license revoked as of 10 minutes ago. Vanessa sneered. "This is a witch hunt. Fabricated hysteria from a senile woman and a rebellious child." "That senile woman just helped dismantle an illegal medical ring," Charles Langston said, entering behind them. "And the child, he'll be testifying." The cuffs went on quietly, but the silence was thunderous. Outside, as Daniel was escorted down the steps, Helen stood in the center of the driveway. Her coat flared in the wind. Her eyes were steel. He saw her, stopped, and for one long haunting second, mother and son stared at each other. His eyes were a storm of rage, shame, and somewhere buried beneath the surface fear. "Mom," he said. Helen said nothing. Daniel's jaw clenched. "You destroyed everything." She stepped forward. "No, Daniel, you did. I just turned the lights on." The officer nudged him forward. Vanessa followed moments later, shouting threats about lawsuits and slander. No one listened. That evening, the front page of the Oakfield Ledger carried the headline, "Respected Neurologist Daniel Monroe, Accused in Illegal Child Drug Trials Daughter Among Victims." Helen read the article slowly, then folded it and placed it in a file marked Justice. She wasn't done, but for the first time in months she could breathe. Ava was asleep in the next room safe. Logan was at the kitchen table doing homework between bites of pizza. The house was different now, not quiet out of fear, quiet out of peace. Helen stepped outside. The wind carried the scent of coming rain. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Let them come. I have nothing to hide and everything to protect." The courtroom was almost empty when the sentence came down, just a handful of journalists, 2 detectives, 1 public defender, and Helen Monroe, sitting tall, dressed in dark blue, her hands calmly folded in her lap. The judge's voice, deep and firm, echoed off the walls. "Daniel Charles Monroe, for the crimes of unauthorized human experimentation, endangering a minor, and falsification of medical records, this court hereby sentences you to 7 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole after 4. Daniel didn't flinch. He stood motionless beside his attorney, jaw, tight hands clamped behind his back. He didn't look at Helen, didn't look at Logan, who sat 2 rows behind her, didn't even glance at the exit where the bailiff waited with cuffs. But Helen saw his knuckles whiten. She knew what that silence meant, not remorse, bitterness. He'd lost control, and that for a man like Daniel was worse than prison. Vanessa's sentencing was quieter, held a week later. Her medical license was revoked. She was permanently barred from practicing or advising in any psychological or pharmaceutical field. No jail time, just silence. She walked out of the courtroom with sunglasses on, refusing to acknowledge the cameras, the whispers, or her children. Helen didn't follow her. Some ghost didn't deserve an exorcism. The paperwork granting Helen temporary guardianship over Ava and Logan arrived by courier 3 weeks later. It came in a thin brown envelope, unremarkable in shape and size, but when she opened it, her hands trembled slightly. It was real, legal, stamped and signed. She read the lines over and over again. "The state hereby recognizes Ms. Helen Monroe as the primary temporary guardian of minors, Logan Monroe, 15, and Ava Monroe, 17, with full legal authority over health, education, and residency." She whispered their names to the empty room like a spell of protection. And then she cried, not the ragged sobs of grief, the quiet tears of a woman who had held on long enough for justice to bloom. They left the old house behind. Helen didn't ask twice. Ava didn't look back. Logan only returned once to gather the remaining surveillance files from the hidden drive in the basement. A week later, they moved into a small, sun-dappled home tucked at the edge of a pine ridge just outside Dalewood. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. The living room smelled of old books and cinnamon tea. The walls were lined with shelves Helen had hammered in herself. She let Ava choose the curtains. Logan installed the Wi-Fi. The day they moved in, Helen cooked lentil stew and sourdough just like Thomas used to like. "I feel like I can breathe here," Ava whispered as they set the table. "You can," Helen replied. Word spread quickly. The story had gone viral after all. People recognized Helen in the market. Neighbors dropped by with extra blankets, used furniture, even hand-carved shelves. But Helen didn't want pity. She wanted purpose. 3 weeks after they settled in, she taped a flyer to the front gate. Free writing classes for kids with something to say. No experience needed. No grades. Just stories. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Contact Ms. Monroe. You don't need to be brave to begin. You just have to begin. It started with one boy, Marcus, age 12, who hadn't spoken to his dad since the divorce and didn't know how to explain the ache in his ribs. Then came Nina, age 16, who wrote poems in the margins of her math textbook. Then 3 more. Then 7. Within 2 months, Helen's living room became a soft haven, warm lights paper, rustling the low scratch of pencils. Sometimes there were cookies, sometimes silence, but always there was space. And every Thursday, Ava sat at the same corner of the dining table, filling pages slowly, not always in sentences. Sometimes just single words: trust, fog, escape, still here. But that was enough. Helen never read her work unless invited, and one day Ava handed her a page. It began, "I used to think I was invisible. Then I realized I was just waiting for someone to look at me and not blink." Helen placed the page in a folder labeled Healing. Logan, for his part, returned to school with a quiet defiance. He didn't flinch when kids asked questions. He didn't correct the rumors. He didn't offer explanations. He just did the work. He joined the robotics team again, took over the coding group, and much to Helen's amusement started building a website for her writing class. Not just a blog, he explained, a portal for anonymous submissions. You'd be surprised how many kids want to say something but can't say it out loud. One night, Helen walked past his room and heard laughter, genuine, uncontrolled. She peeked in. Logan sat cross-legged on his bed phone in hand, FaceTiming Marcus from the writing class. She didn't say a word, just smiled and let the moment be. Every Sunday morning they walked together, sometimes just Helen and Ava, sometimes all 3, down the ridge trail, past the mossy rock, through the wild lavender that bloomed in the spring. They didn't always talk, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer afraid. It was rebuilding, one step, one breath, one story at a time. Months passed. The seasons turned. Helen received a letter from the state. Due to the stability and welfare of the minors under her care, Ms. Helen Monroe's guardianship is hereby made permanent, pending full adoption proceedings if desired. She didn't need the adoption. They were already hers. But she framed the letter anyway, hung it above the dining table. A reminder justice wasn't just about courts or sentencing. It was about staying, about choosing love even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the treetops, Ava asked if they could go to the lake. Helen drove. No questions. They sat on the dock, feet dangling above the water. "I'm scared it's not over," Ava said quietly. Helen took her hand. "It's never fully over," she admitted, "but it can change. We change." Ava looked out at the horizon. "Do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" Helen didn't answer right away. She squeezed her hand. "I don't want you to be normal," she said. "I want you to be whole." Ava nodded. A small smile flickered, and in that moment, with the sky bleeding gold and the wind brushing their cheeks, Helen knew they were free. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer dictated the shape of their future. Mornings at the little pine-shaded house came slowly. They arrived without alarm clocks or urgent knocks or whispered threats through closed doors. They came with the smell of toast and the quiet click of a kettle, with the rustle of newspaper pages and the occasional hum of old jazz on the radio. It had been 6 months since the courtroom, since the doors closed behind Daniel Monroe and the dust finally settled. And in those 6 months, something extraordinary happened. Nothing. No outbursts. No terror. No sirens. Just the slow, deliberate restitching of a life torn apart. Helen Monroe no longer counted the minutes between traumas. She counted the pages in her students' journals, the number of poems pinned to the refrigerator, the freckles that appeared on Logan's face with every afternoon walk in the sun. They had survived, and now they lived. She kept a ritual now. Every Sunday morning after breakfast, she sat at the old desk by the east-facing window, the one Thomas had helped her sand down decades ago, its grain still warm with memory. She opened her manuscript folder, now thick with drafts and margin notes, and typed one sentence before anything else. "This is not the story of a victim. This is the story of a survivor who stayed." The book had a name now, A Stranger in My Own Home, but not because she still felt like one. No, that title belonged to a past version of herself, a woman who had once been overlooked, dismissed, institutionalized. Now she claimed it as a badge. She had been the stranger once. Now she was the house itself, the heart of it. Life with Logan and Ava was quiet but rich. Logan was always tinkering wires, circuit boards, AI bots that half worked and half failed spectacularly. He made a little app that tracked local mental health resources and anonymously connected at-risk teens with writing workshops like Helen's. It was already getting attention from 2 nonprofits. "I'm not a social worker," he told her once, embarrassed. "No," Helen said, "but you're a builder." And this is what hope looks like when someone decides to build it. Ava bloomed in her own way. Slow, deliberate, beautiful. She had returned to school, with conditions, therapy, support. A trauma counselor who didn't speak down to her or pretend that healing had a deadline. But more than that, she had returned to herself. She laughed sometimes, really laughed. She wore colors again. She let the sunlight hit her face without flinching, and she wrote. Lord, did she write? Every notebook she owned was full of scratched-out sentences, scrawled metaphors, sticky note epiphanies. One day she sat across from Helen at the dinner table and said, "I want to be like you." Helen set her fork down. "I hope you get to be exactly like you," she replied. Then came the day Ava was invited to read a personal piece at the school's open mic assembly. She almost declined. Too much pressure, too many eyes, but Helen encouraged her gently. "Not for them," she said, "for you." So on a warm Thursday morning in May, the 3 of them drove to school together, Logan with his headphones in, Helen holding Ava's trembling hand in the front seat. The auditorium was packed. Parents, students, teachers. Helen sat in the back, watching. Ava walked slowly onto the stage, microphone trembling in her hand, paper clutched like a lifeline. She looked down once, took a breath, then began. "My name is Ava Monroe, and for a long time I thought being in a family meant becoming invisible. I thought that love meant silence, that safety meant obedience, that survival meant shutting my mouth, lowering my gaze, and saying thank you when I was hurt. But then I met someone who reminded me that family isn't supposed to shrink you. Family is supposed to make room. A grandmother with calloused fingers and a spine made of fire taught me that. She didn't save me by storming the gates. She saved me by staying, by listening, by believing. And now I believe in myself too. Family is where you get to be who you are not, where you're forced to be who they need you to be. Not a subject, not a patient, not a secret. Just me. And that I've decided is enough." There was silence, not the nervous kind, the kind that follows truth. Then came the applause. Some were crying. Helen wasn't sure when her own tears began, somewhere between, "I thought that love meant silence and spine made of fire." When Ava stepped down, she didn't rush. She walked head held high and smiled, not at the crowd, at Helen. That evening after dinner and dishes, Helen returned to her desk. The manuscript was almost done. She had only one more paragraph left. But before she wrote it, she closed the folder for a moment, sat in the silence, listened to the soft laughter of Logan in the next room. He and Ava were watching a show, arguing over plot holes. It sounded like music. She smiled, then opened the folder again, typed. In the end, the house was never haunted, just misunderstood. And once the truth came to light, it turned out the ghosts weren't real. Only the love was. She saved the file, leaned back, and looked at the old typewriter on the shelf beside her desk. It hadn't been used in years, but tonight, maybe just maybe, she took it down, dusted it off, fed in a fresh page. Crack! The carriage snapped back into place. Clack, clack. The keys pressed down.